Hello and welcome back. Today we are looking at our final lesson for Chapter 9, Section 4, The Second President. We've been talking about George Washington as the first president, and he was kind of asked to be the president. So now we need to figure out a way to transfer the power of the president to the next person. So we're going to look at how that went down with the election of 1796 and then the election of 1800, and ultimately policies that would lead to the downfall of the Federalist Party. As you can see, I've already done an audio recording, and the key picture for today is of dueling pistols, and that will make a little bit more sense by the end of today's lesson. So that's a little clue as to something that we'll be talking about today. But if you want to continue on with the video recording, let's go now and look at our key terms for today. Some of our key terms are the XYZ affair. That sounds a little weird, but we'll talk about that. Frigate. The Alien and Sedition Acts. This was a hotbed, so. And sedition itself, which just means stirring up rebellion against the government. Nullify, which means to cancel. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which led to the issue of states' rights, and that states' rights is going to be an issue that we will talk about a lot over the next few months. So I want you to know that it really got a push during this time, especially with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. But before we begin our actual lesson for today, I have a quick question for you. How many of you have ever performed before an audience? I have. When I was growing up, among other things, I took piano lessons, and every year we would have a big piano recital. Now, I wasn't the best student, but when I felt like it, I did practice, and especially around the time of the recital, I would always try and get my recital piece as close to perfect as possible. And the big day would come, and we would get up and perform our piece. And I remember one year in particular, and actually it was this year. This is a picture of Mr. Huebner in 1990. See if you can pick me out. And I had practiced really, really hard, and I was really excited to perform until Jordan Webster got there. Now, Jordan was a year younger than me, but he was very talented, and on top of that, he worked really hard. So right before I was going to go on, Jordan gets up and plays this absolutely amazing piece. Parents were applauding, the rest of the students were applauding, and then I had to perform next. I was a little bit nervous before the recital, but having to follow Jordan took my nerves, which are about here, all the way, that made them skyrocket. No matter how much I had practiced, it was difficult to follow someone who I thought was much better than me. And it's difficult to have confidence at a time like that, but I still had to get up and play. I shouldn't have tried to compare myself to Jordan because I was doing the best that I could. So little Easter egg for you: if you hover over that picture, it immediately takes you to an extreme close-up and extreme zoom of yours truly, 1990s Mr. Huebner. Now, I may have had a difficult time following Jordan, but that was nothing compared to John Adams, because he had to follow George Washington as president in the United States. Washington was extremely popular, so Adams had some pretty large shoes to fill. Washington was tall and dignified, but Adams was short and kind of round in the middle. Washington spoke very little, and when he did, people listened because it was generally pretty profound. But Adams was brilliant, but he would speak very quickly and spoke a lot. And both men held to their beliefs, and though Adams was a very different man from Washington, he was still a great president because he tried to act in the best interest of the country. So in the previous lesson, we talked about John Adams becoming elected as the president. Well, very shortly after he became president, he faced a pretty huge international crisis. You remember Jay's Treaty? Well, France was not too pleased with that because they felt that it favored Great Britain. So in 1797, they started to seize American ships in the West Indies, just as Britain had done just a few years earlier. Americans again called for war, but this time they called for war with France instead of Britain. So to avoid war, Adams sent diplomats to Paris to discuss the rights of neutral nations. So the American diplomats, they get to France expecting to deal with the Prime Minister of France, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. Well, he chose to not deal directly with the diplomats, but sent 3 agents to offer up a deal. So even before negotiations could begin, the French agents stated that Talleyrand wanted $250,000 for himself and $10 million as a loan to France. And after hearing those demands, one American replied, "Not a sixpence," which, like, not a penny, and left to inform Adams about these demands made by the French Prime Minister. So when Adams addressed Congress with the French proposal, he didn't name the French diplomats, he just referred to them as X, Y, and Z, which is why this has come to be known as the XYZ affair. And once again, war fever was ignited in the United States, and despite strong public pressure, Adams refused to ask Congress to declare war on France. He, just like Washington, wanted to keep the United States out of foreign affairs, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore these French attacks on U.S. ships in the West Indies. So instead of declaring war, Adams decided that naval strength instead of more treaties would be the way to combat the French attacks. So by building frigates, which we can see right here, and a frigate is just it's a fast-moving ship with a lot of guns. So Adams chose to invest money in building frigates to help boost the U.S. Navy, and he hoped that by doing so, it would convince France to stop attacking U.S. ships. So our first video is going to talk a little bit more about all of this.
During his first year in office, President John Adams sent representatives to Paris to try to negotiate an end to the undeclared war between America and France. But the French demanded that the United States pay them bribes before they would even start talking. This event, that came to be called the XYZ affair, insulted the American negotiators so much that they sailed back home and saw to it that old treaties with France were repealed. That same year, in response to the growing threat of war, the ship seen here, the USS Constellation, was built. The Constellation had 36 cannons and was the first U.S. Navy vessel ever to capture a foreign warship. The ship that it captured belonged to France.
Now, during the crisis with France, the Federalists pushed a lot of laws through Congress known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. And under the Alien Act, the president could kick any foreigner out of the country if he felt that person was dangerous to the country. And it also made the Alien Acts made it much more difficult for immigrants to become citizens. Now, why did they do this? Well, among other reasons, the Federalists made this law because a lot of the recent immigrants supported Jefferson, and by passing the Alien Acts, it would keep those immigrants from being able to vote for many, many years. So, and under the Sedition Act, the Sedition Act stated that any citizen could be fined or jailed if they criticized the government or government officials. And this angered Republicans because it directly opposed the First Amendment, which guarantees the right to free speech. And under this act, a lot of Republican newspaper editors, citizens, and even some members of Congress were fined or jailed for speaking their minds. And as you can see, the Alien and Sedition Acts led to fights in Congress and led to actual physical altercations even in Congress.
In 1798, the United States faced its first constitutional crisis when the Federalist-controlled U.S. Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts.
So what they proposed to do was insulate certain figures in the federal government from the more scurrilous and excessive criticism, particularly on the part of popular writers and newspaper editorialists. So what they did was, in 1798, was pass a series of laws, first of all, giving the president the right to expel from the country those aliens who were, in time of war, potentially a threat to the government. Second of all, it gave the president the right to prosecute critics for seditious libel.
The Alien and Sedition Acts were a series of 4 laws enacted not only to protect America, but also designed to weaken and eventually destroy the Democratic Republican Party.
Ultimately, the Alien and Sedition Acts were an effort on the part of the Federalist Party to put the political opposition out of business. That was basically what they intended to do. I mean, they did so by making it a crime punishable by fine and imprisonment for criticizing the government. Bringing the government into disrepute was a crime.
The Alien Act targeted foreigners. It gave the president the power to imprison or expel all such aliens as he shall judge dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States.
And what we're talking about here is really the French, also maybe the Irish, because the Federalists felt that the French and the Irish, who were immigrating this country in the 1790s, always joined the radical, Democratic Republicans. So, hey, get these guys out of business. The main one of the Alien Acts was the one that extended naturalization from 5 years to 14 years.
The Alien and Sedition Acts were an attempt to limit the scope of legitimate criticism of the government. And what it meant is that they haven't fully worked out the idea of a loyal opposition. A very sophisticated and important idea.
Clearly, these acts run contrary to the spirit of freedom that America was established on. And indeed, I think any responsible interpreter, especially in the cold light of day, having 20/20 hindsight, would say that these acts were contrary to the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which protects the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. But at the time, supporters of President Adams, people who were members of the Federalist Party, thought that these laws were needed to protect the United States against subversion, either from within, by our own citizens whose sympathies ran against the government and possibly toward foreign powers, or from without, aliens who were in the United States but whose loyalties weren't to the United States.
Whereas the Alien Act targeted foreigners, the Sedition Act targeted U.S. citizens. The Sedition Act made it a crime for American citizens to write, say, or print anything false, scandalous, and malicious about the government, the Congress, or the President.
It was probably, a lot of people felt an out-and-out violation of the First Amendment because it curtailed both freedom of speech and freedom to print criticisms.
So this is the early toddling stages of American political discourse. And at this point, they hadn't gotten the idea that you could have a robust and legitimate criticism of the government without endangering the government with anarchy or civil war.
Now, President Jefferson, future President Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, and the Republicans, who were the primary opponents of the Federalists in those days, loathed the Alien and Sedition Acts. They thought they were an outrage and an abomination and a violation of the Constitution of the United States. But of course, they weren't in power yet, and so during Adams' administration, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed and applied.
There were about 15 indictments brought in the federal courts for violation of the Sedition Act. Remember, this was the one that said you couldn't criticize the government. And so they singled out certain of these prominent editors, and the federal government did indict them for a violation of this act. There were, I think, 10 convictions, and some people actually went to jail. Matthew Lyons was a famous case up in Vermont. He spent, 4 months in jail for what we would consider today, I think, fairly modest criticism of President Adams.
So leading the Democratic Republicans was the Vice President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson was highly opposed to the Alien and Sedition Acts. He couldn't ask the Supreme Court for help because the Supreme Court was controlled by the Federalists. So instead, he went directly to the states and pleaded with them to nullify or cancel those acts. He argued that the states had this right and could resist the power of the federal government if necessary. And with the help of Jefferson and Madison, the states of Kentucky and Virginia passed the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions of 1798 and 1799. And these resolutions declared that each state had the right to judge for itself whether a law was unconstitutional. And if the state finds that law unconstitutional, it has the power to nullify that law within its borders. Now, why do you think this is important? Well, remember earlier how we talked about setting precedents? Well, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions raised this issue of states' rights, which I mentioned before would become a very hot issue in American politics for years to come. But the issue of states' rights specifically was a question over how strictly to interpret the Constitution. Remember, one of the big differences between the Federalists and the Republicans was over a strict interpretation of the Constitution or a very loose interpretation of the Constitution. If the Constitution only spells out the specific powers of the federal government, then are all other powers given to the states? Do states have the power to declare laws unconstitutional? Now, eventually, the Alien and Sedition Acts were dropped, but this issue of states' rights and whether or not states had the power to declare laws unconstitutional was going to continue for years and years and years to come. So that's really the big issue that comes to the forefront with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Are they constitutional, and do the states have the right to nullify those acts if they deem them to be unconstitutional within their own borders? It's pretty big. But getting back to foreign policy. Now, I said that Adams refused to go to war with France, and this angered a lot of people. Well, this angered a lot of people within his own political party. Hamilton, our good buddy Alexander Hamilton, and his followers criticized Adams because they believed a war would force the nation to build up its military and would help to increase federal power. But war would also weaken the French-supporting Republicans. So Adams, as president, resisted the pressure from Hamilton, and their disagreement caused a split in the Federalist Party. Adams sent diplomats to France against the advice of his good friend Alexander Hamilton, and upon their arrival, they met with a very young and very headstrong Napoleon Bonaparte, who, at this time, was in charge of planning war against several other European nations. Bonaparte really had no desire at this time to go to war with the United States, so he signed an agreement to stop seizing U.S. ships. So Adams had succeeded in keeping the nation out of war, but his actions really cost him the support of a lot of people within his own party and weakened the Federalists for the upcoming election of 1800, which we will talk about after this next video.
During the final year of the 18th century, George Washington, the man who had come to be called the father of his country, died at the age of 67 from a throat infection, an illness that could have easily been cured using modern medicines. That same year, a man called Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in France. This change in leadership made it possible for John Adams to finally work out a peace deal with the French just as his term of office was ending. Only 4 years later, a new American president, Thomas Jefferson, helped work out another deal with Napoleon that pushed the boundaries of the new nation far to the west of the Mississippi River and doubled the size of the United States.
I told you we were going to talk about the election of 1800, and here we are. So finally, by the time 1800 rolls around, this cry for war against France had basically faded. People really didn't want to go to war with France anymore. So with the impending war no longer a really big political issue, the Democratic Republicans focused on two major issues for this election. First, they attacked the Federalists for raising taxes to try and prepare for the war. And second, they opposed the very unpopular Alien and Sedition Acts. And the race was really between Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Thomas Pinckney. Jefferson as a Republican, Adams running as a Federalist, and Thomas Pinckney was also running as a Federalist. The Republicans won the popular vote, and that was due in part to this split that had occurred in the Federalist Party. But when the Electoral College voted, they split those votes between Thomas Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr. And at that time, the Electoral College did not vote separately for the president and the vice president, so each Republican elector cast one vote for Jefferson and one vote for Burr, leaving it tied. And under the Constitution, if there is a tie in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives votes to determine the winner. And after 4 days of voting, the House finally named Thomas Jefferson as the third president of the United States.
As the presidential contest of 1800 approached, the Federalist Party was split between supporters of President Adams and Hamilton's hand-picked candidate, Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina. Now Jefferson changed tactics. He turned from orchestrating resistance behind the scenes and stood again for president. An ambitious but erratic young New York lawyer named Aaron Burr ran with him. It was one of the dirtiest elections in American history. The Federalists savaged Jefferson wherever and whenever they could.
The election of any man avowing the principles of Mr. Jefferson would destroy religion, introduce immorality, and loosen all the bonds of society. To vote for Jefferson is no less than a rebellion against God. The Reverend William Lynn.
Jefferson gave as good as he got and paid money himself to a drunken editor named James Callender, who attacked John Adams and spread gossip about Alexander Hamilton's private life. Jefferson's mind, Adams said, had been soured and eaten to a honeycomb with ambition. In early 1801, the Electoral College met in the new Capitol to pick the next president. When the votes were counted, it was clear that neither of the Federalists, Adams or Pinckney, would ever have enough votes to win. Jefferson now found himself battling for the presidency with his one-time ally Aaron Burr. Each man had 73 votes. The House of Representatives would have to settle things. Congressional voting began on February the 11th, 1801, and went on for 6 contentious days and 36 separate ballots.
The scene was now ludicrous. Many had sent home for nightcaps and pillows, and wrapped in shawls and greatcoats lay about the floor of the committee rooms, or sat sleeping in their seats. At 1 and 2 and 2:30, the tellers roused the members from their slumbers, and took the same ballot as before.
They were hopelessly deadlocked. When rumors spread that the Federalists might refuse to accept a Jefferson victory, the Republican governors of Pennsylvania and Virginia vowed to send their militia to seize the capital. Many feared the American experiment was failing. One man held the key. He alone could persuade his fellow Federalists to break the deadlock. Alexander Hamilton disliked Jefferson, but he despised Aaron Burr, whom he thought a most unfit and dangerous man. To him, the survival of the new republic was at stake. Finally, at Hamilton's urging, the Federalists gave up. The exhausted legislators elected Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd President of the United States.
The Revolution of 1800 was as real a revolution in the principles of our government as that of 1776 was in its form. We can no longer say there is nothing new under the sun, for this whole chapter in the history of man is new. The great extent of our republic is new. Its sparse habitation is new. The mighty wave of public opinion which has rolled over it is new. The order and good sense displayed in this recovery from delusion, and in the momentous crisis which lately arose, bespeak a strength of character in our nation which augurs well for the duration of our republic. And I am much better satisfied now of its stability than I was before it was tried.
And soon after this election, Congress passed the 12th Amendment, which would require electors to vote separately for president and vice president. The states ratified it in 1804, so finally there was a way for power to pass peacefully from one party to another. But this election was really the beginning of the end for the Federalist Party. Federalists won fewer and fewer seats in Congress, and in 1804, the party lost its major leader, Alexander Hamilton, when he was killed in a duel by Aaron Burr. Despite the decline, the Federalists did have a huge hand in really developing the new nation, and the Republican presidents who followed actually kept a lot of Hamilton's economic policies in place. So, as a party, they were really only around for 8 to 10 years, not very long, but what they were able to accomplish in Congress and what they were able to do in setting up really getting the economy in motion that had a very lasting impact on the young United States. And just for fun,
And that was the Vienna Wood Dance in B, one of my all-time favorites. And now let's make that random call with today's $10,000 question. It's a tough one. Who shot Alexander Hamilton in that famous duel? All right, let's go to the phones and see who's out there. Hello, for $10,000. Who shot... Excuse me? I'm afraid your time is almost up. I'm sorry. Maybe next time.
Got milk?
Which brings us to our assignment, or lack thereof. There's no written assignment associated with this lesson, but you will be required to know the key terms and the key things that we talked about today in the lesson for the upcoming Chapter 9 test. So the key terms, and specifically the impact of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the things that led to the decline of the Federalist Party and the election of Thomas Jefferson as the third president of the United States. All right, like always, if you have any questions, please come and find me, and I'll do my best to help you out. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.